The Securities and Exchange Commission's cybersecurity disclosure rule went into effect just about 1 year ago on December 15th, 2023. And since then, it's really made quite a fuss, and we have a lot of questions about it. So here with me today to answer some of those questions is Jeff Pollard, VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester. Next week at the Forrester Security and Risk event, he's going to be giving a session, I'm sure that's going to get a lot of attention, which is a CISO's life preserver for SEC disclosure requirements. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to talk about this.
So the thing that people are, I think that's been the big question mark since before this even went into effect, was the question of materiality, because the issue with the cybersecurity disclosure rule is that you have to disclose an incident, a cyber incident, if it has made a material impact. And you have to disclose that within 4 days of when you have determined whether or not it has material impact. So how do we even know if an incident has made a material impact or could make a material impact?
That's the big question, because the definition of materiality is, I guess I'll phrase it this way, wonderfully vague from a United States case law and regulatory perspective. And I'll share what that definition is, and I'll go a little slow through it because it's got some interesting conditionals in there. A matter is material if there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider it important when determining whether to buy or sell securities. And if, like me, you hear that and then you say, that answered nothing. I completely agree with you. In fact, that's one of the big things that we uncovered in this research and looking through 8Ks, 10Qs, 10Ks for the materiality requirements for descriptions of security organizations based on item 1.05 and item 106 rules. We didn't see a lot of breaches declared as material in the last year. Very few sort of reached that threshold. And the breaches that were considered material, there are real question marks as to whether or not it was the breach itself that was material, or whether the breach is kind of scapegoated for some other corporate circumstances that might have led to earnings misses. Because that's one of the interesting elements of this, right? Is that, let's say we're having kind of a down quarter and we experience a breach, and that's kind of public. Could we sort of pawn some of the reason for missing our quarter on the fact that we had a breach versus the fact that strategically we didn't sell as much as we needed to, or something else happened within the enterprise that could have stopped us from that? So a little bit of a shell game going on as to whether or not this is real, and whether the ambiguity in that definition is good or bad for security leaders and companies.
Wow, that's a lot to parse out there. So first, when you say that there weren't that many, there were only a few, what number are you talking about? 5, 4, 400?
We had less than a handful, so there were less than 10 total. As of when we completed the research, there could be a few more now, but there were less than 10 total that we saw when we did the research. So we went through about 150 or so different 10Ks, 10Qs, and 8Ks that were declaring breaches or conditionally declaring breaches potentially material, and we had less than a handful. I think the count when we finished the research a little bit earlier this year was around 5, so about exactly a handful, maybe a few more now, but we haven't updated it in December to check it out. But that was as of, I think, around the sort of September, August timeframe, we had seen 5.
Okay. Now, if I'm a company that thinks to myself, hey, a breach might actually sound better than whatever this other reason is. I'm wondering what might lead me to that conclusion, because there's two potential, and there's two things that spring to mind for me. One could be that my investors might not actually be able to tell how bad this breach was and what kind of an impact that might actually make. Another could be that the breach was actually caused by a third party. And so maybe I can say, well, this wasn't really my fault. But what have you seen based on on the reports that did come in this year? Kind of what can you infer from what you saw?
I think the easiest example to point to are situations involving ransomware, especially in industrial environments. So on a manufacturing floor, for example, if you are a company that requires manufacturing to ship a product, so you're making a physical good, whether that's a consumer product company, whether that's hardware, electronics, whatever it might be, if you're actually assembling things or you've got something you manufacture and ransomware shuts those capabilities down, then that's a real impact, right? It can stop you from being able to ship a product, which can interfere with orders, which can interfere with revenue, which can interfere with bookings, things like that. So those are the more sort of tangible examples of where this is a real problem and it could have material impact. Now, of course, the thing about materiality is that when you think about it from a security leader perspective, you are not the person that determines materiality. And that's one of the big things to get across from this research, right? As a CISO, that's not your job. Your job is not determining materiality. In fact, mostly because if you think about it, a lot of CISOs are not actually corporate officers. They're not signatories of an 8K, a 10Q, a 10K. They're not a corporate director. They're reporting into one, often in the form of a CIO maybe, or a CEO, but they're not the person determining materiality. At that level, it's really sort of internal, external counsel, possibly the board of directors, and the CEO that's sitting together to determine whether or not something is material. But I think the best or easiest example for most to kind of realize is something along with ransomware. If something shuts down your ability to make whatever it is you make, if you're a SaaS company, if ransomware shuts down your ability for people to get to your product, if you're a manufacturer and ransomware shuts down your ability to make something that people need to buy and that could impact the orders you have for that quarter, that's when it's a little bit more obvious that it could be material. Again, the question sort of sits, let's say a company is having a down quarter and there's ransomware, would they have missed that quarter anyway without the ransomware? That you don't always know, but you assume that's kind of factoring into the decision in some way.
Okay. So are you at this point ready to issue any, I guess, guidance to CISOs, or what at least have you determined from what people are reporting, how are they giving investors too much information, not enough information? What, I guess, norms are being set at this point?
We've already seen some correction in the norms. One of the things that was happening kind of early with this is that companies were releasing an 8K or an update, right? An update report that said something to the effect of, we've had a cyber incident. We don't know if it's material yet. We will update you later on once we figure out if that's material. And the SEC's already sort of stepped in and said, we don't like that. Don't do that, right? You need to make a determination. Let's not just kind of flood the zone with too much information. Let's actually make a determination and then update investors and shareholders accordingly with that. So that's kind of one norm that's already been corrected out there. I'd say the other norm that we've seen kind of widely put in place is that when you talk to external counsel in particular, maybe even internal counsel, so your general counsel or someone else on the legal team, there used to be this kind of thing inside companies where you'd hear, don't say the B word, right? We didn't have a breach, we had an incident. Because we haven't determined if it's a breach. A breach is a legal term, and incident is not a legal term. So you'd hear, don't say the B word, because that we haven't decided if we've had a breach yet, because we may not have met the legal threshold. The new word that's entered into that, beside the B word, is the M word. So in those internal communications now, don't start speculating about materiality. Right? That's something that, again, counsel needs to be involved in. So you had a cyber incident that might impact operations, but there doesn't need to be internal speculation about whether or not that is material, because the board and the corporate directors, both internal and external, will be the ones to make that call in consult with counsel. So that's one of the other things, right? So one of the norms developing here is, in the same way we trained ourselves not to use the B word, we're training ourselves not to use the M word around materiality, because we don't know yet. And if you start saying it's material and you don't notify within 4 days, well, that's a track record of saying, well, you thought it was material 8 days ago, but you didn't report until you officially determined it 7 days later. Why? You opened the door to questions being asked from a regulatory perspective. So that's definitely one of the norms we're seeing developed out there.
So besides, I mean, clearly there's a lot to still understand about materiality, right? That we've established. Beyond materiality, what else are CISOs I want to say struggling with, but let's just say maybe they're all having a wonderful time with this. What are they experiencing that the rest of us who might have to go through this in 2025 need to know?
Yeah, so I think the other big thing is we've talked a lot about materiality, but that's just one of the things that we have to do now from an investor perspective. The other part of this is actually giving an overview of the cybersecurity program, its organizational structure, its alignment, its reporting structure, the qualifications of the people within the cybersecurity program, how risk is being overseen and managed from a cybersecurity perspective by the organization. So that's the other part of this, and that's in all of those 10 Qs where we're now describing our security program and what kind of controls we have in place and what frameworks we map our security program to. So that's the other part of this requirement. And I think some of the interesting takeaways from that description of our overall security program that we're now making public, one of my favorites is that if a CISO thought that the days of kind of credential inflation, if you think back to when you first got your job and you were padding your resume out with whatever you could, if you went to the doctor the day before, suddenly you were a healthcare expert, right? Because you're applying for that job, you're trying to get it. If you thought by the time you reached that CISO gig that you were done with that, yeah, you're totally not, because that's back in vogue now. Because as companies are describing their leadership, the people that are running their security program, they want to make that person seem as awesome as possible. So that kind of credential inflation is coming back. One that we saw talked about a director of cybersecurity that had an MCSE security, which is a certification that I don't think has existed for a while. I could be wrong. Microsoft will be mad if I'm wrong about that. But an MCSE plus security, I had one of those in like 05. I think, or 07-ish. And so now we're seeing things where people are described as, being a security expert because they have a certification from 20 years ago. Who knows if they've even worked in security since then. And I think in the case of that particular 10K, it was a director of IT that had done security before. So some of that is definitely coming back, but also you need to be able to articulate what's happening in your program, your org structure, whether you have a cybersecurity steering committee. If you've aligned to things like NIST CSF, for example, as a framework, you need to be able to articulate all that and make sure that the folks that are writing your annual report, especially your CFO and others, understand that so they can include some of those details. So CISOs are going to be tapped on the shoulder, they probably already have, to provide some of that so that can go right into those annual reports.
Is it too early to assess whether or not investors actually care about this information, if it's actually going to make any difference?
I think it's way too early. I think so. The positive of this regulation is that it will equip us to learn a lot more about cybersecurity programs from some of the world's largest companies than we ever knew before. And that's a tremendous positive. That level of transparency, which kind of has to come from a regulatory body, is terrific. 2 thumbs up from that standpoint. Whether or not retail or institutional public investors care about the qualifications of a CISO or whether or not you have an information security steering committee, I think as they're making the investment, probably not. As they're thinking about the shareholder lawsuit after you experience a breach that comes as a result, which is almost inevitable and guaranteed, then it becomes fodder and ammunition in that, especially if you were vague or you were ambiguous or you weren't doing enough. But I don't think that anyone is on a day trading platform or, a trading platform of any variety or buying an index fund or whatever, and they sort of open that section up and they see 2 paragraphs and they say, well, I'm not going to buy that stock. I don't think that matters yet. But again, I think from the standpoint of moving the industry forward and giving us a level of transparency we never had before, it's fantastic because it gives us a set of, I don't want to say best practices, but to your point earlier, norms that we can all look towards. And that's a good thing.
Now, I know that this is really for publicly traded organizations, but if I'm not a publicly traded organization, do I still have things that I need to know? Do I need to worry about it because maybe I'm a software company that is still part of the supply chain of a publicly traded enterprise? Is this something that is ultimately eventually going to be part of my daily life as a CISO?
You have to think it will for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, regulation begets regulation begets regulation. And we are definitely in the era of what I call regulatory FOMO, meaning that if you are part of a cabinet, of an agency body, of a body that's part of a government, a pseudo-governmental body, an industry body, whatever it is, you probably have announced and launched a cybersecurity regulation, because that's what everyone does. If you don't have one, you're not cool. So first and foremost, there's that absolutely happening, right? We are in the era of regulatory FOMO. So if I've got model legislation or model regulation I can steal from and then issue my own, I'm absolutely going to do it. Every government around the world, it's what all the cool folks are doing now. So that's kind of number one. But to your point, one of the things that I've researched and talked about over the last few years, in fact, at our Forrester event the last couple of years, and I'll be doing it again this year in another session, is talking about the impact of what's actually driving cybersecurity spending and cybersecurity programs. And there's a new dimensionality to what's driving the decisions we make in cybersecurity programs. And that dimensionality is the obligations our customers are putting on us about our cybersecurity posture. So security is not a cost center the way it used to be. Cybersecurity is now a profit center. And the reason why is because your customers are asking you questions about your security program. And so as publicly traded companies are more transparent because they have to be, if you're a private company, that's the measuring stick you're going to be held up against when you're filling out those third-party risk management questionnaires to a potential partner, right? You can't be as cagey anymore, because now one of your competitors might be publicly traded and they're forced to give a lot more detail than maybe they did before. And you're going to have to give that much detail, because no one is going to partner with you if you put their security at risk. Because that's where so many breaches come from, right? Is some third party that we were exchanging data with or had access to our environment. So I think that's one of the other things CISOs of companies that aren't publicly traded need to be aware of. You're going to have to get more transparent yourself and think about those third-party risk management questionnaires, because if you are a little more cagey with those, you may lose business because your publicly traded competitor already has to give a lot of information out that you don't have to.
Got it. Makes sense. All right. Final question, Jeff. The SEC has been led by one person and is soon going to be led by somebody else. Do you anticipate that disclosure requirements or any other requirements might be enforced differently going forward? And I know I'm asking you to see into the future, but is that something that you or anybody else at Forrester is looking at right now?
I don't cover politics, so I can't tell you how one administration is going to treat it versus another.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for your time, Jeff. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
No, none at all.
We just did that great of a job that we don't have anything more to say.
That's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff Pollard, VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester.